Welcome to the show. We're going to talk about repairing the DNA damage of the culture, of the church, of the family. We're going to bite off a lot in the next few minutes, so you'll want to buckle up and listen up, because this is a very important show with a very important guest. I'm going to read you a quote, and then we'll drop the shoe after the main intro about who said it and what the context was. Quote, "If Catholics would simply live the sacrament of matrimony for one generation, we would witness a transformation of society and have a Christian culture." Coming up, Dr. Scott Hahn on the Patrick Coffin Show. Coming up straight ahead. Don't go away. So glad you're here. Dr. Scott Hahn is the author of over 40 books. He is the Father Michael Scanlon Chair of Biblical Theology holder at Franciscan University of Steubenville, my alma mater, I note. He's the founder and president of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. He's the father of 6, the grandfather of about 15, possibly more. We'll catch up. And the husband to 1. Dr. Scott Hahn, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Patrick. Now, the number is 18 now. 18,
man. Every book, it's like, well, congratulations. You're prolific in more ways than one. And it's
well, yeah. That's just from the first 3. Michael, Gabriel, and Hannah. Jeremiah and Joseph are in seminary now, studying for the Diocese of Steubenville to enter the priesthood.
Okay.
Jeremiah is 1 year away from diaconal ordination. We're kind of
wow, that is crazy. I remember him when he was you can tell him this. I remember him as an inert bag of lentils when I was studying there, in his mom's arms, and sometimes his dad's. So a little bit of history for folks who don't know. You and I have known each other since about, I want to say 1991. I remember a long, rambling Chinese dinner in which we discovered our great love of a guy called Fulton J. Sheen, and that was the beginning of a great
Deacon Lennon's
time.
house. Yes.
That's right, Deacon Lennon's house in beautiful Dearborn. So I was saying off air, I've read a lot of your books. I won't say all 40 plus, but I remember working as I did a copy edit on A Father Who Keeps His Promises, and I knew that this is going to be the first, or not the first, it wasn't your first book, but I knew this is going to be a churning well of creativity, and I want to thank you for writing.
Right. It was my first book.
Really?
The first book we did was Rome Sweet Home. Kimberly and I co-authored that, but
correct.
A Father Keeps His Promises was my first solo effort, so you're right.
Is the one we're going to talk about today your most recent book, The First Society, The Sacrament of Matrimony?
It is. Okay. I'm working on 3 or 4 other projects right now, but this is the one that came out the most recently.
Yeah, I think, I've said this is your most important book. Maybe I should say one of your most important book. At least by most important, I mean most directly of practical value to people who are now wondering where we're going and why we're in this handbasket.
Right.
It's the destruction of the family and the attack on marriage has been happening under our noses for 50 years or so now. But I thought we'd start with some definitions. When Catholics hear the phrase marriage and the Catholic thing about marriage and the attitude of the church, for instance, things like indissolubility, as you point out in the book, this is not a Catholic thing. The institution or the reality of marriage it belongs to nature as well. It's something that Christ raised to a supernatural level, but it was pre-existent before the incarnation, right?
Right. And here's where we have to begin by a balancing act, because on the one hand, it really is an ordinance of the natural law. It goes back to creation, but it also reflects the very structure of what it means to be human and how we are fulfilled. On the other hand, I think we also have to recognize, especially in our day and age, that we're not going to win the culture war by arguments strictly from natural law, not secular arguments, as Jennifer Roback Morse has pointed out. We really have to proclaim the natural truth of marriage in terms of the supernatural grace of the Sacrament of Matrimony. Mm-hmm. That kind of summarizes the entire book. So maybe I'm squeezing an ocean through a funnel, but we can backtrack and kind of break it down.
Matrimony suggests motherhood.
That's right, one mother.
Mm-hmm. It's a deliberate phrasing of our Holy Mother, the Church, correct? That's an intentional title.
Very much so.
Which means, among other things, that because I want to talk to you as we go along about the goods of marriage versus the ends of marriage, and the children as the fruit and crown, as Vatican II says. Are natural law marriages, prescending from sacramental ones, they're also indissoluble, correct?
That's right. I mean, atheists, non-Christians, unbelievers, they all have human nature, and so they all have the freedom, the opportunity to enter into this contract we call marriage. And I think that the more we look into it, the more we can see that from the very beginning it was this way. It also has a dimension that is not just secular, but sacred. That is to say, it also involves and invites the presence and the assistance of God, even for atheists who don't believe there is a God. Mm-hmm. So if I don't believe there's a God, I don't eradicate his existence, I just don't recognize it. So there really is a sense in which marriage goes back to the beginning. That's why I call it the first society. Mm-hmm. And it was something that was designed to be natural and secular, but it was also incorporating the sacred and the divine. And this is something that, our society has obviously lost track of because we've privatized religion, we've relativized conceptions of God. And so this is like speaking a foreign language to many people out in the public square.
Would you say that the Jesus and me mentality of the Reformation and its intellectual progeny is part of the acceptability of divorce? I mean, in terms of Henry VIII, yeah, obviously, but me and Jesus is sort of anti-communitarian.
Yeah, and it really predates the 1500s and Martin Luther. So, Luther was indebted to a philosopher who was back in the 1300s named William of Ockham. Mm-hmm. And Ockham basically argued that universals are just names. There's nothing real about human nature. All that's real are human individuals. And so individualism really begins at this period. By the time you get to Luther, almost 2 centuries later, who famously declares, I am nothing if I'm not an Ockhamist, this idea of a relationship between me and Jesus, and assurance of my salvation, right, my personal salvation. You ought to, pursue your certainty. I have mine. I mean, this is a kind of sacred individualism that then gets adapted 1 century later in terms of a secular individualism by Descartes and Spinoza and the philosophers who basically move from faith to reason, from theology to philosophy. They discard the church and they expect the state to be the enforcers of this notion of individualism, which then produces the notion of contract, social contract. Mm-hmm. And to reduce marriage just simply to an individual contract, I think, is a fatal step. But it's one of several. And I think you're right in pointing out that Luther's own religious individualism contributed to it. He refuses to accept marriage as a sacrament. He not only introduces divorce and remarriage and justifies it in terms of the Old Testament, but in a letter that he hoped would not get out to a prince, he even advocated a form of private bigamy if you could keep this under wraps, if you could keep it a secret, which it didn't happen.
Since you're talking about it with me now. Right. Right. Wow. So it's also wedded, it seems to me, to private interpretation. All this atomized hyper independence idea. I guess rugged individualism. He was more American than a Texan in that regard.
Yeah. There are so many permutations of this. I think what we often fail to see is what Patrick Deneen has pointed out. Patrick Deneen has written a book recently, Why Liberalism Failed. And when we hear liberalism, we assume that's the left wing of the Democratic Party. But in fact, a century ago, liberalism was practically the same thing as individualism. And what Patrick Deneen points out is that the Enlightenment roots of individualism have basically corroded all social bonds, especially marriage and family, but even all of the bonds that would hold communities together apart from government coercion. Mm-hmm. So what we're looking at is it doesn't go back 50 years, it goes back even more than 500 years. And so the kind of genealogy or archaeology that is implied in this book, in some ways I've done the research in other sources. This one is sort of an attempt to distill, to popularize, and to communicate in a way that is effective to people today, that we can really see the need to go back to something that is truly ancient, but something that is also common sense.
Let's go way ancient, and I mean back before the appearance of word cleaver, okay? To Adam, the first man. It's not good for the man to be alone. That line is not about Adam's widow feelings of loneliness, right? What's more profound about that line?
Well, you have to look at what comes before Genesis 2, and that is the material in Genesis 1 where over and over again. God creates the day and the night. He creates the sky and the sea. He creates the land and the vegetation. And every time, it is good. It is good. It is good.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he creates man, it is very good, except that it is not good. Lo tov in the Hebrew. It is not good that the man would be alone. Now, on the one hand, if we look at that, we recognize, okay, this is because man is created in a state of nature called by grace and all the theological. But I mean, just again, down to the grassroots, man is made for woman. And so he's invited by God to name all of the animals. And then the next phrase is, but a suitable helper was not found for him. Mm-hmm. Well, dog is not man's best friend. Eve was. And that friendship is a covenant, and that covenant is marriage. And that's really the primordial form of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. It isn't just to have an intellect whereby you know what is true, or a will whereby you choose what is good and love. It's finding a beloved and entering into that kind of communion that is not just a contract on the one hand, but it's also not just an individual thing where you're reflecting as a philosopher and just contemplating the truth in isolation.
So therefore, the analogy with the Trinity is not bottom up, it's top down. God as community forms the exemplar of marriage and family then.
And John Paul really nailed this when he described, the Trinity is really a divine family. That fatherhood is not something that originates with the physical, the biological, or the human. It originates in eternity with the divine. It's more spiritual than physical. It's more theological than biological. Dogs and cats copulate, but they don't generate persons. Mm-hmm. God the Father eternally generates a person and empowers us to also generate persons, but not without his assistance. And so there is a mystery here that goes beyond the biological. It even goes beyond the philosophical, because, in fact, every soul that is human is created by God out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at egg and sperm for dogs and cats and horses and cows, that zygote, egg and sperm, the material elements of fertilization are sufficient to communicate the full nature, but not for humans. God has to create me as a person. The spiritual substance of my own soul is fashioned by God out of nothing. Now, not apart from my mom and dad coming together, not apart from the fertilization of egg and sperm, but as a divine act. And so what we have to bring to the table, I think, is something really important. That is, the dignity of the human person is not something that is discoverable by biology alone. It really was something that philosophers came up with, too, apart from the revelation of the Word of God, apart from Christ himself.
So you're talking about the both and over and over again.
Over and over again.
Human, divine, nature, grace. My first book, The Contraception Deception, I place the beginning of the end with the truce of 1968 and the wide rejection of Humanae Vitae. But I'm aware that the attack on the family predates rejection of Humanae Vitae. Let's go back a little bit, guys. I'd like to pick your brain as to when you think the serious attack on marriage began. Was it? I mean, there's certain liminal dates, like 1957, the Roth decision, which redefined pornography and placed it closer to free speech, therefore not just obscenity. You've got the pill being approved by the FDA in 1960. Before that, you have all kinds of subsurface things happening liturgically. The Second Vatican Council didn't happen out of a vacuum. It happened out of a need for renewal and restoration. Where do you think the glue came undone, Scott, in and outside the church with respect to marriage?
That's a great question. And I would say you have to provide an answer that is, I hate the word, but nuanced. And you've already proposed that, because like every process, it involves something more than just one point in time. I would say let's distinguish the near cause from the proximate and the remote. The remote cause, I think, is Protestantism, basically saying that marriage is no longer a sacrament, that it is simply a contract, and therefore it is subject to the state, not to the church, etc. And in no time you have divorce and remarriage and that sort of thing. Now that's the remote. I would say the proximate is in 1930, when the first Protestant denomination introduces this permission for contraceptive intercourse between married spouses. It's the Lambeth Convention, as you know, and the Anglicans basically say contraception ought to be avoided, but it is tolerated under these unusual circumstances.
And only within marriage, of course.
That's right.
Right.
So the thin edge of the wedge, the camel's nose, whatever you want to call it, that is what produced Pius XI's great encyclical. It ought to be much better known.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you and I share a love for Casti Connubii, that is on Christian marriage, that came out in 1930. And that's where you have the three goods of marriage drawn from Augustine, but it's really drawn from natural human experience, proles, fides, and sacrament. You have the offspring, the proles. You have the permanence, that is the exclusivity, that is the fides. And then the sacramentum is the indissoluble bond of marriage. And this was a great counterattack. Unfortunately, it had not been radically or permanently assimilated by the Catholic Church in America. And so I would say that the near cause was, in fact, Humanae Vitae and the revolt that it causes in 1968. And the very fact that you have Roe v. Wade in 73 appealing to the right to privacy that emerged in the Supreme Court case Griswold versus Connecticut back in 1964. I mean, what was Griswold about? The sale of contraceptives in Connecticut, which was a predominantly Catholic state.
Right.
And it gets really complicated, but I think we could point to Humanae Vitae as that which really rocked the world. It was a subtle but seismic event.
Having just interviewed Abby Johnson and actress Ashley Bratcher, I note that most people don't realize that the Griswold of the Griswold versus Connecticut, I want to say 65 there, she was a Planned Parenthood director.
Right.
So this is another intertwining of the origins of life. You're going to tamper with the fundamental origins of life. Of course, you're going to have these other evils once the inexorable logic begins to kind of take root.
And John Paul developed the theology of the body that's been much discussed and all of that. What I like about it is that the fact that you can say that the most fundamental human right of all, before we have the right to, free speech or any other, is the right of the human person to originate from the love of the male and the female, the husband and the wife.
Yeah.
That is the most basic right that needs to be protected, and not just for the Catholic Church, but for human culture, for what it means to be a man or a woman.
That's one of the I would, pick your metaphor, one of the first dominoes. If that domino shakes and falls, look out. And what you just articulated is the widely rejected truth right there.
Yeah.
Because that's...
I'm going to say something a little more esoteric than the other things I have said so far, but it kind of connects the dots, because we've been talking about individualism. We've traced this back to the Enlightenment and beyond, all the way to the 1300s and Protestantism in the 1500s. But I think that we have a situation where we have become so welded to abstract thinking that we don't even know how to think in concrete terms anymore. Individualism has basically taken hold of our intellect and our imagination. So we think that when a human being comes into existence, that person is an individual. The concrete reality is otherwise. Individuals are not what you see. You have a son or a daughter, and it's not just a male or a female. There is a relational ontology. There is a family matrix. Even if the family is broken, even if the marriage is dysfunctional, even if it was conceived out of wedlock, it's not an individual. It is a person, but that person is a son or a daughter, not just reducible to gender, male or female. And to me, the medievals got that. And we can get it, but only after much effort. And it's like, why does it take so long for us to rediscover the obvious, the self-evident? But I think it's because we've been so ensconced in this kind of individualism that we define freedom in negative terms. It's freedom from other people we don't want, and it's, whereas in the Middle Ages, it was freedom for the virtues that we need to be perfected, the virtues that we need to be faithful, the virtues that we need to be honest and happy in relationships and that sort of thing. But relationships are strictly voluntaristic, and so they're nothing more than contracts that you can move into and move out of at will. And this is sort of the stuff that nobody questions anymore. And when we walk it back, we recognize that, wait a second, you just can't say this baby's inconvenient, I'm going to walk away. I mean, you can if it's in utero, then you can abort. Now infanticide is around the corner.
Yeah, it's with us, yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And so we should be surprised at how surprised we are that infanticide is now with us, because, even if it takes centuries for logic to beat a path down the corridors of history, nevertheless, human culture, especially our own, proves that it does just that, that there is something consistent about what we're doing and what we're decrying and complaining about. When we trace it back, it isn't just the 60s. It isn't just the sex revolution. This has roots that go much, much deeper.
And with this confusion comes the confusion about the definition of marriage itself. It's all kind of a piece. As we have this conversation, I've just heard that the homosexual mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg, or Buttigieg, or as I call him, Booty Judge, he and his husband are going to have a son. I'm like, how are you going to do that, Pete? The idea of the child having the right to come into being from the warm, rumpled sheets of a marital bed, and therefore love that's like crazy talk. That's far right extremist. Who knows what? That's right. And he's been challenging the Mike Pences of this world to get over it. Yeah, it's between. Your arguments with my creator, he says. Oy.
Yeah. And I would just say that the Creator has designed it so that child did not emerge from you and this other man. It couldn't.
Yeah,
okay,
right.
Adoption is a beautiful thing, but adoption is a derivative thing. And so what it is you're deriving from is egg and sperm. It's male and female. And so it's like, do the math.
Yeah.
But nobody wants to do that. And I would say, at the very outset of the show, you were quoting somebody, and I want to finally get around to who it was.
Yeah, I was. We can drop the shoe now, because it's one of those moments that was meant by the speaker as an aside, but was like a flaming arrow that you pondered for a long, long time after. Who was it? What was the context?
This goes back to the mid-'80s. I was a Protestant still, but I was enrolled in the PhD program at Marquette in Milwaukee, and I went there deliberately. I'd gotten a full ride at Notre Dame, but there was really nobody there worth studying under. There is now, but not then. And there was one man at Marquette, a Jesuit by the name of Father Donald Keefe. And I had been reading his articles, and I had discovered from him that he was working on a kind of magnum opus, a massive 2-volume work that was still about halfway finished, entitled Covenantal Theology. And that was my thing, my bailiwick. And so I went to study under Father Keefe. In my very first semester, I was taking this doctoral seminar on religion and society. And we were reading a book by then Lutheran Richard John Newhouse. He later became a Catholic and later became a Catholic priest, in fact. But it was entitled The Naked Public Square. And it was hot off the presses, and it was being debated all over. And again, this was the mid-'80s. And so Dr. James Dobson Focus on the Family was just getting started. John Paul II was still rather youthful for a bishop of Rome. And for the first time, we saw this evangelical Catholic alliance in practically every abortion clinic in every major city. And so these were exciting times to discuss what is the role of religion in the public square. Should we exclude it, or should we invite that freedom also to be expressed? And Newhouse, of course, was encouraging everybody to express freedom. To be an American citizen is to be free to express your Christian or your Catholic values. And we were debating this in the doctoral seminar. There were people who are on the left, people on the right, people are in the center, and all of that. And then he would go back to his lecture, and then we'd discuss things more, and he would go back to his lecture. In the middle of his lecture, he wasn't looking at us. He was looking out the window, and we wondered why, because we hadn't seen him do that before. And a flying saucer, what is it? It's just a nice blue sky. And then he interrupted his lecture to just say this. He said, if Catholics simply lived the grace of the Sacrament of Matrimony for one generation, he said the result would be a transformed culture, a Christian society, regardless of who we elected, regardless of what laws we passed. But I suppose I'm digressing, so I'll get back to my lecture. And I'm like, no, don't keep digressing,
Right.
And he went back to the lecture, but I didn't. And I don't know if anybody else did, but I was transfixed by what struck me at the moment as a kind of hyperbole. I mean, this is rhetorical access to make a point. But the more I thought about it, 5 or 10 minutes later, the more it kind of felt like a laser beam landing on the back of my retina, this burning insight. Like he just penetrated into something that goes beyond all the debates, all the journal articles and books, all of the politicians and their promises, the grace of the Sacrament of Matrimony. And I was a Protestant at that time.
Yeah.
I was to believe that there were 7 sacraments and not just 2, and that matrimony was going to be one of them. But if it was a sacrament, I'd come to this point where I was on the brink of becoming a Catholic, where I began to see that if the Catholic Church is right about itself, then it's not merely a human institution. Mm-hmm. It's a divine institution, instituted by the God-man, that it's not just an organization that celebrates sacraments. It's a sacramental organism constituted by these 7 sacraments that are not primarily rituals that we do for God to get his help. They're primarily what God does for us to give us his power, to make up for all that we lack. And the implications of this were not only theologically interesting, they were socially profound and practically momentous for me. My marriage was being rocked by considering the Catholic faith, but at the same time, I was really finding that this truth of the Catholic Church's teaching was what I've been searching for years and years.
People are not aware of how deep the conflict went between you and Kimberly. This is not a discussion about whether you're going to have mustard or ketchup at a picnic. This is a serious rift.
Right. So we've been married 40 years now. We finally feel like we're entering the promised land in terms of friendship and fun and laughter. Just last month, we got to go to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage. I had gone without her with the kids. I had also gone with her and the kids, but I'd never been with her without the kids. Now, there were 180 fellow pilgrims in 5 buses, but we got to hold each other's hands more in those 9 days, I think, than the last, 5 months or so.
Right.
But it really is a sense in which we have gotten to the point where friendship and joy are the kind of common experience, but it wasn't always that way. And we were reflecting upon it one evening because we had been married in 1979, and I was received into the church in 1986, so 7 years afterwards. But I had been ordained a Protestant minister at Trinity Presbyterian Church in 1982, so just 3 years after we were married. Her dad was a Protestant minister, her brother, her uncle, and now her other brother too.
Yeah.
So for me to go in search of a church that wasn't Protestant was really a deal breaker. She wouldn't have dated a Catholic, and now she was married to one, and not just an ordinary Catholic, as she put it. So anyway, I came in 1986. She came in 1990, but I didn't think for most of those 4 years she ever would. Things got tense, stressful, and everything else. And so when she did come in 1990, Ash Wednesday, she announced at Easter Vigil, we celebrated it. But for the next 5 or 6 months, we found that we had really formed some terrible habits when it came to communicating, respect, affection, that sort of thing. And we thought, well, once you enter the church, this will be dispelled, but anything but. And so we went to Catholic marriage counseling. A guy down the street was an excellent counselor, and he helped me, he helped her, and then he helped us by explaining why it's a sacrament, because we're too weak to enter into this and do it on our own. We need God's help. He provides it in the sacrament. But like every marriage, even with the sacrament, you go through these seasons of life, these seasons of love. Spring when we fell in love, summer when we got married, fall when I began looking into the Catholic Church, and then winter when I did and she wouldn't. Yeah. And so he just walked us through all of this and then gave me assignments to take her back to the movie theater where I'd first told her I loved her, dance to Orleans, You're Still the One, other silly things.
That's awesome.
But we were ending the conversation by saying, on the one hand, nothing has fulfilled us individually more than marriage, and yet nothing has frustrated us more than marriage. I mean, she has been the instrument of grace to me more than any 1,000 people, and yet she has also been the instrument of frustration, And I have been frustration to her a lot more than she has been to me. And so it's like 40 years, and you learn a lot of lessons, that you couldn't pick up in assignments in college. But in the process, the Catholic Church gives us something that no politician will ever describe as timely. It's timeless truth. It's true in the beginning, it's true now, until the end. And if we don't get it back, so much the worse for us, not so much worse for the institution of marriage.
That's all great backstory. That's really rich, Scott. I was thinking about the fact that the church in her wisdom does not mention our feelings when we pronounce the wedding vows, right? The operative verbs are I will and I do, so help me God. And that's that third person, right? You and I are both sons of Bishop Sheen, 3 to get married. Jesus Christ as the font of the graces that you mutually bestow.
Or as I would put it as a Protestant back then and a Catholic now, in a contract, you exchange promises and then you exchange property. Mm-hmm. And I give you my word, you give me your word, and the word is my name, my signature, that's the sign. And my word and your word, that's the glue that holds us together in a contract. But to have a covenant, you have to invoke God's name. God's name becomes the cement that makes the two one. And what God has joined together, let not man put asunder, and let not man deceive himself into thinking that he can put it asunder. As Chesterton said, divorce and remarriage is not just bad morality, it's bad metaphysics. Mm-hmm. Humans aren't stronger than God.
There was another Chesterton quote along those lines. I'm probably going to botch it. I hope Dale Alquist is not listening. Marriage
He's lecturing here tonight.
Oh, great. Please give him my regards. He's a very good man. Marriage is the battle to the death that no honorable man should pass up, or something like that. So it's a battle. It's true. Yeah, there's a what's the word? A compatibility problem. Young couples, I don't know if we're compatible. I just, we fight sometimes, and I don't know. Are you a boy? Yeah. She a girl? Yeah. Okay. You're not compatible.
Figure it out.
So,
yeah. We love to share the story of a priest who was questioning these kids who were getting ready for confirmation. And he had covered the sacraments, and so he asked them, what was it that Jesus said about marriage? Blank stares until finally the little boy raised his hand. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the priest said, no, yes.
Right.
Indeed.
A+.
Exactly.
So 7 years after you got married, you became Catholic. 3 years after your ordination. 7-3. Coincidence? Have you pondered the numbers before? Probably.
Indeed, I haven't. No.
See, this is why I'm here for you. I'm just a sausage factory of insight tonight. Let me kick the tires of the sacramental part. I was watching someone I admire very much, an English politician. He appears to be kind of posh in his affect, almost kind of librarian-esque, but he's really a warrior, and that's Jacob Rees-Mogg, conservative British politician, and he's makes no bones about the fact that he's a serious Catholic. He's got 6 kids. They're all like multiply named after saints. And in his interviews, when he's asked about the definition of marriage, he refers to it commonly as a sacrament. And I've wondered if that's it's certainly good metaphysics, and it's true. But back to your earlier point about starting as much as you can with common ground, and then introducing things that are specifically Catholic. My objection to that line of thinking is that might lead the enemies that we have, culturally speaking, to say, well, yeah, of course, thank you for saying what I've been saying all along. You have your sacrament, go inside your church, we'll leave you alone, and you leave us alone, because we have our gay marriage, polyamorous marriage, whatever it is. Do you see how that might be a weak link in the chain, or a Achilles heel in a way?
I saw it more clearly like 15 or 20 years ago, where I thought still that if we make these sort of strategic rhetorical compromises or concessions, we might win. Well, by now, I think it's pretty clear we're not going to win. So why bother with the compromises or the concessions? I think the best thing to do right now is to proclaim the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and let the Spirit of God decide how the outcome will play out. And so, like Jennifer Roback Morse, we're not going to win the culture through secular arguments. It was never by natural law alone, a derivation of Paul, that we're saved by grace and not by works. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, if our civilization is going to be saved, it's going to be saved by rediscovering what the Greeks and the Romans believed apart from any sort of biblical revelation, namely that marriage is not reducible to a contractus. It is a fetus. It is a covenant. In fact, in Roman law, you see it being described as a sacramentum. And even if it was violated more often than it was honored, nevertheless, you can see that apart from Christian revelation, apart from magisterial teaching, there really is a common pool that we call tradition that we've got to tap in order to show that this is true apart from faith and revelation. But now we also have to recognize that it's not going to convince people apart from the Holy Spirit. I think this is why the new evangelization is so important. Not simply in personal and private discourse, but also in public discourse. It's what Paul was reminding the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, that, it's through the folly of preaching that it is the word of the cross. And, the cross is foolishness to those who seek wisdom. It is it is a stumbling block to those who are, what does he say? It's foolishness to those who seek wisdom, and it's weakness to those who are looking for signs of power. And yet, it is the power and the wisdom of God. And so I think God has brought us to a point where he would like to do more with less. That is less philosophical reasoning, less sophistication. There's always going to be a room for natural law arguments and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I really believe that not just for us privately as individuals, but for cultures too, it's going to be supernatural grace that will enable persons to rediscover the natural law. And at the same time, it's going to give them the power that we've always needed to fulfill it in our own families.
Well,
the sacrament, as I point out in the book, the sacrament doesn't make it easy. The sacrament is what makes it possible.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that in our generation that we will face jail time because of our insistence on the definition of marriage as a sacrament, as the union of one man and one woman until death do us part? Because it depends on how court cases are decided. I'm thinking of people like Jack Phillips, who had an uphill battle against several Goliaths and finally won in the end. But if decisions start going the wrong way in the jurisprudential sphere, Catholics and other Christians are going to be in trouble with respect to interacting with Caesar. Are you hopeful or realist? What's your take on what's around the corner?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, to quote a prophet named Amos. I would say this, that the more we approach this level of discourse where traditional morality is called hate speech, the more and more vulnerable we are. I think what we've got to do is develop rhetorical strategies to show that calling traditional morality hate speech is itself hate speech. And I this whole idea that male and female is a social construct. Again, I think we have to just clarify the fact that no, believing that gender is a social construct, that belief is a social construct. But the fact is, we know ourselves to be male and female because we are sons and daughters at birth, brothers and sisters as we grow up. And again, even if we have broken relationships in the family, we know what our heart longs for, and that is to make these relationships right.
I just spoke with a very brave English Catholic journalist, wife and mother, named Caroline Farrow. And Caroline has made the terrible mistake of misgendering someone on British television. And she has been ritually shamed, cast out of polite society, deplatformed. Her kids have been doxxed. Just the most despicable abuse against this woman. People like Ryan Anderson. All the shows, including this one, is likely to be deplatformed by our good friends at YouTube because of what you just said. You said that male and female are not social, pliable, bendy constructs. That itself will get you cast out of the ball on media platforms. So then it becomes a question of how do you exercise your right to free speech and to proclaim the gospel without compromise and have an audience that will connect with your message. Twitter's doing this, Instagram's doing this, Facebook, all of big tech are clamping down on what they euphemistically call violations of community standards.
Yeah, I think this is also where we ought to be willing to kind of stand alongside of Orthodox Jews as well as Muslims and say, if you're going to attack us, attack all of us, because we stand together on certain things. We disagree on some other things that are pretty big, but these things in some ways are much, much bigger. At the end of the day, we're not primarily against gay marriage. We're not primarily against homosexuality. We're not primarily for heterosexuality. I'm a heterosexual. I've got close friends who are same-sex attracted, and all of us share one thing, and that is original sin and the effects. And so heterosexuality is not the solution because that leads to lust, fornication, adultery, and all of the rest. Homosexuality, we're all disordered sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. And so I think what we've got to really focus on is the fact that we need to be healed in our relationships. We also need to be instructed as to where to go from here. I'm always reminded of, I think it might be one of your favorites, but it's certainly our family's favorite movie, Princess Bride, where Zinni keeps using that term, inconceivable, until finally Inigo Montoya says, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means, Yeah. And that word is marriage. I think if we come back again and again, not blasting their misdefinitions, but just simply clarifying the fact that a marriage is itself the revelation of a love that is life-giving, that human life does not naturally emerge from any other form of love or friendship. There's love between brothers and sisters, love between, neighbors, but only the love of a husband and a wife is designed by God, or nature, if you will, to produce what we call human persons, sons and daughters. And if they can do that in a way that brings out the love that blossoms from commitment, I think if we just keep pointing that out and then, use Scripture as well as our own practical experience to indicate what happens otherwise, we don't have to target what we're against as much as what we're for. And I mean, the implications are going to be clear and the persecution will be inevitable. But I think we'll be avoiding that kind of, accentuating the wrong syllable by defining ourselves primarily in terms of what we're against.
Yeah, that can be very embarrassing, for sure. Yeah. Now we come to the heart of it, which is, you mentioned you can love your brother, you can love your father, you can love your children, your boss, your pastor, your neighbor. But what characterizes marriage, that love relationship, is characterized by sexual intercourse. And sexual intercourse must be able to be performed for it to be the sacrament of matrimony. That's a hard saying, Scott, for people who, for whatever reason, are not able to. And yet, this is one of the ironies of debating people who want to redefine marriage. And I did it for a lot of years on Catholic Answers Live. When you simply go Socratic and you say to someone who thinks that there should be marriage between two men and two women, sir or madam, what's your definition of marriage? There's invariably this awkward pause because they haven't really come up with the definition. They know what they want to be included in. And so the side that stands for licentiousness and, progressive, license, unlimited freedom, their definition of marriage is invariably an emotional one. It's a marriage between two people who love each other and care for each other. And we're the ones who insist on the presence of sex. It's just a rich irony to me.
Right. The interpersonal relationship of a man and a woman in marriage, whereby the two become one flesh, as you read in Genesis 2. I remember the first few months of marriage, we joked, the two become one, but which one? Me? No, you.
Right.
But, then along comes the blessing of God, and the two become one flesh, and the one we become is so real that 9 months later we had to come up with a name. And Michael was that firstborn child who embodied our oneness, was the incarnation of our love, and he made us three in one, a triunity, a human reflection of the divine family. And again, I think the more we proclaim that, we're taking not only the moral high ground, but we're kind of lifting up people's visions to something beyond politics, to those noble human aspirations that are, in a certain sense, irrepressible, even in really a darkened age such as ours.
Mm-hmm. How important is it to just stay married and struggle and realize that if you're going to leave your spouse because you want to follow your dream, don't forget your kid's dream. And their dream is to have mom and dad together.
That fundamental human right to remain that living expression of the love that brought me into existence, and to see those two sacrifice in order to, nothing is harder, nothing is more fulfilling, nothing is more important for the next generation, nothing is really more fundamental for the common good, rightly understood, again, in terms of philosophical logic, natural law, human experience, and the tradition that we share with all of the other civilizations, But at the end of the day, for me to live out my marriage is so much more important than for me to write it up or to speak about it on this show or any other, And again, I would say it's sometimes easier to write about it and talk about it than it is to go back home and live it out. Yeah. Especially when we had 6 kids and 3 teenagers and all of the rest. I mean, even the two most, compatible people are going to disagree when it comes to the most important matters, which is how are we going to raise our sons and daughters? And so, again, this is why it's all about grace.
Why does the church traditionally and to this day strongly recommend, it's not forbidden otherwise, but strongly recommend that Catholics marry Catholics?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it can only be a sacrament if the two spouses are baptized. But what about a baptized Protestant? Well, again, there's an accommodation in canon law so that disparity of cult would allow 2 baptized people, one Catholic and one non-Catholic, to enter into marriage. But at the deepest level, the one thing that we are called upon to share is not just simply marriage in the natural order, It is the marriage supper of the Lamb in the supernatural order. That's why the ordinary form of the Sacrament of Matrimony is celebrated in the context of the Mass, because the two really illuminate one another and they reinforce one another. It really was this conviction that the Eucharist is more than a handshake, it's more than a hug, it's more than a kiss. It really is a supernatural analogy to the one flesh union, which is the natural bond of marriage. And so, again, one hand washes the other. The Eucharist was, for me, the thing that gave me the understanding of God's mercy, to forgive her, but also to apologize to her. God, who's all holy, you're not just willing to forgive me, you were dying on the cross to do so, to unite yourself as the bridegroom to your bride, and to wash her with the water of the word, as Paul says in Ephesians 5, then, what is it that is too much for me to sacrifice for my bride? Well, there's no real good answer to that, because look at what Christ did. And so what I realized was I have to live out the sacrament of the Eucharist in order to show her the sacrament of matrimony. And in the process, I also had to live it out by the sacrament of penance. I went to confession back then every week, and still do now after 33 years. And Kimberly never once suggested that I go too frequently, right. Because she could see the difference, empirically. Yeah. The one time I skipped a week or two was final exams as a PhD student, and she could smell the spiritual stench. And she asked me, when's the last time you went to confession? At dinner, she asked me. Like, it's none of your business. You don't think it's a sacrament, And I said, it's 3 weeks, pass the beans. But nice. I reflect upon that later, and I realized that, if I had gone 3 weeks without a shower, would I have been surprised that they didn't notice the physical stench? Hardly. Well, I hadn't gone 3 weeks without showering because I was taking care of my physical hygiene, right, but not the spiritual. So the next day I was back in line at St. Bernard's, and Monsignor heard my confession, and an hour later at dinner, Kimberly and the kids were suppressing smiles because they could tell something had happened. I was different. And that's when I kind of renewed that pledge to not let 3 weeks go by again. But I think married couples need the Eucharist. Married couples need reconciliation. And so if only one partner has access to the Eucharist, only one partner has access to the grace of reconciliation or to confirmation, then it really is a kind of one-legged race. I mean, there isn't the kind of parity that we need to provide the other all that God wants for us to give.
That was Parity, right? Parity.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, marriage with two Orthodox, practicing Catholics is hard enough. That's my view.
My wife would sell really? Double amen, like, truly.
Early, you mentioned pro les fides and sacramentum, the ends. What are the goods of marriage, and how do those two lists, those two angles into the same scene, how do they differ? What are the goods of marriage?
Okay, so the goods of marriage are the bona conjugale that Augustine's writing about, that Pius XI is also referring to in Castic Nubi back in 1930. Yeah, those three goods are pro les fides and sacramentum. That is offspring, fidelity, and the indissoluble bond that is formed by the sacrament. Now, when we speak of the ends of marriage, what we're talking about are really the ends of the marital act. And so we speak of the primary end of marriage being the procreation, education of offspring. And then we also speak of the remedium concupiscentia, because it really is a natural and sacred outlet for our desires, which aren't always rightly ordered. So it's a remedy for concupiscent desire. But the primary end of the marital act is like the primary end of eating. You don't want to reduce eating down to nutrition. You want it to have fellowship and friendship, but you can have fellowship and friendship without food. Likewise, you don't want to reduce marriage down to just copulation and procreation, but you can't have offspring apart from the husband and the wife. Yes. And so it's a reduction to what is the one thing, that's sine qua non. And without marriage, you're not going to have children. And so the primary end of the marital act is the procreation and education of offspring. And then, of course, Paul VI and then John Paul introduced another category, the unitive and the procreative meanings of marriage. Yeah. So you have, in a sense, one primary end, the procreation and education of offspring, two meanings, the unitive and the procreative, and three goods, pro les fides and sacramentum, offspring, faithfulness, and indissolubility.
Now, contra what some traditional-minded Catholics want to say, that was not a rejiggering or a changing of doctrine. That was a rephrasing of what Casti Connubii proclaimed from the pen and the heart of Pius XI, right? This is not a new thing. It's a different way of saying the old thing. Am I overplaying the card?
No, I don't think you're overplaying it, but I think you might be underplaying not a sense of novelty, but a sense of authentic development.
Mm-hmm.
When you look back on the first 1,000 years, you realize that distinguishing nature and person was critical for theology, because God has one nature but three persons. Christ has two natures in one person. So introducing the distinction between nature, which is what we have, and person is who we are, you can see that Casti Connubii is looking at the natural law and the natural end of marriage being procreation, education of offspring, whereas beginning with Humanae Vitae, the unitive and the procreative meanings of the marital act should not be separated. By the time John Paul is explicating all of this in terms of the theology of the body, what he's doing is personalism that goes beyond the what of human nature to see how in natural law there's only one form of love that produces offspring. It's looking now at the persons and what difference it means for this interpersonal communion of male, female, husband, wife, to share the two becoming one, and yet at the same time being fruitful and multiplying. So the procreative and the unitive meanings really reflect Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, and Genesis 2, the two become one flesh. Because that unity is so important for couples that can't have children but would be open to. And so you have that balance, the coordination that doesn't reduce marriage just to what we could know by natural reason, about natural law, about natural end. I think there's a kind of breakthrough and an argument from fittingness that goes beyond just the mere necessity of fulfilling natural law, but just how, when I heard John Paul's Theology of the Body, I was still a Protestant, not sure I'd become a Catholic, but whatever I become, I'm taking this with me.
Right. I've interviewed Layla Miller on her difficult-to-read book, Primal Loss, and it's 70 stories of people who are adults whose parents divorced sometimes decades before. And all these people have one thing in common. They never get over it. And the other thing they have in common is, as Layla says in the book, no one ever asked them how the divorce of their parents affected them. They were just like hidden players, spear holder number 14 in the drama of their family. Do you think
it's such a fundamental tear in the fabric of our own life to see that the two who came together, the one that I am because of those two, and now they're apart, you just feel torn down the middle. Your heart itself is really ripped in two.
Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers?
Oh, yes.
Deacon Harold said something once to me on the air. He was talking about his own experience as the child of divorced parents, and it just really stuck with me, like your Father O'Keefe thing stuck with you. He just meant it as a throwaway line. He said, Catholic couples who leave their spouses take the cross that Christ gave them and they lay it on the shoulders of their children. I thought, man, that's true. That is true. And that just really got me.
I'm gonna use that line. I mean, that is not only true, that is real in the lives of friends of mine who I have come to know deeply. Boy, that too is a laser beam insight.
Could you credit me falsely instead of Deacon Harold? It would mean a lot.
Let me think about it for a while. No.
Okay, for a while, no. We have a few moments left, Scott. I wanted to direct the last few minutes to men. I'm a married man, you're a married man, and I've detected a great hunger among men to step up their game. I don't know if it's because marriage is enjoying a new round of attack. I don't know if it's the new generation that grew up with a stigma-free divorce culture, but I've noticed a greater openness among many Catholic men to convert their man cave into a library and to stop going with the flow and don't be so anxious on Sunday to leave Mass for the big game. How can men, shed a lot of the barnacles? And, I just tweeted the other day, and it got a firestorm of responses. I basically asked, Dear Catholic brothers, why are you wearing flip-flops and cargo shorts to Mass? You wouldn't wear that to a wedding or to a job interview or to dinner with the Queen of England. And you'd think I had, murdered a kitten or something. But that the external.
Mind if I
go ahead.
Take credit for that quote.
Let me think about it for a while. No.
I do believe that what revolutionizes human life for men more than all the other things put together is becoming a father. Some more than others, but for each and every man I know, becoming a father is just world changing. And it's like slow motion. It doesn't just happen that particular day the child was born or the day you bring him home. But over the course of time, it forces you to recognize just how selfish you are and how much easier marriage was when it was just the two of you, and how you've got fundamental decisions to make every morning, afternoon, and night as to how will I help? How will I sacrifice? How will I assist in raising this child or these children? And you're either going to grow up or you're going to go out and to the bar or to the man cave or to a sports game and that sort of thing. And I do sense that people are looking around and finding just the landscape. The terrain is barren, and no pun intended. I mean, you just look out and you see wasted lives. People who are richer than I am, more intelligent, more talented, and yet they're burned out and burned to a crisp. And why? Because they just turned their back on these relationships that weren't as exciting as fame or whatever else they were seeking. And I think it's a wake-up call. Some hear it, others don't.
Yeah.
I think every one of us has trouble responding to it with consistency because there's always that drag inside of me that just wants to take it easy and wants to take shortcuts and that sort of thing.
You've said that matrimony is the sacrament, the vocation for laymen. I think one insight that men have lost is that we are made for combat. We're made to be fighters. We have dragons to slay. We have a princess to either rescue or a queen to lay our lives down for. And if you're just a schlub watching the game, watching some other adventure, millionaires with tight costumes with someone else's name on it, you're not a participant. You're a spectator. You're not on the gridiron.
Right.
Just speak a little bit about masculine identity being inexorably tied up with combat.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fight is out there, but it's also in here. You have to recognize that the battlefield begins in my own heart, where I'm so easily enticed by things on the internet or styles of clothing or the lack thereof, that sort of thing. And so this is why the medicine of God's mercy that I receive in going to penance once a week, but it's also the fact that being a husband and fatherhood is not really possible without what we're sharing now and what we share with other, and that is brotherhood, the kind of fraternal accountability that we need now, probably more than at any point in the history of the Catholic Church. And so, I think that men need to come together and recognize this common call to holiness is going to have to form a band of brothers. One of my favorite series, watching it with my boys. But another thought just kind of intrudes, and that is, apart from the discipline and the instruction that I've given to my 6 kids for the last 38 years, I also have discovered sort of, surprisingly, that one of the greatest gifts that I gave my kids was to show a lot of affection and respect to their mom. Even when I didn't feel like it, especially when I didn't feel like it. So, I would say that just showing that kind of respect and affection and tenderness when they're not there, so it's not just a show when they arrive, but that kind of thing my kids feed on. When Kimberly and I used to hug and we had little kids, they would just kind of squeeze in between us because they could feel the force of love that gave them life, even if they couldn't form one sentence to explain why.
Yeah, it makes them you can almost see them grow visibly. I remember my dad, he's been gone almost a year, April 27th last year. I remember just seeing the little flirtation stuff they would do in the kitchen, when a little pinch walking by, watching them dance together. I felt like I was, more of my being is, full. It's beautiful. It's ineffable.
It is. Yeah, really good.
ScottHahn.com, is that the best way? Is that the shortest distance between listeners and you?
ScottHahn.com, but actually, I mean, what Kimberly and I have poured ourselves into the last 20 years or so is the St. Paul Center. So stpaulcenter.com.
Okay.
And most recently, the book that I did 20 years ago, A Father Who Keeps His Promises, that we talked about at the top of the show, that is the foundation for a brand new series we call Genesis to Jesus. And so you can go to genesistojesus.com and see all 12 episodes. And I would really encourage people to go deeply into the Word with your spouse, with your kids, and just let them see the joy of the gospel. ScottHahn.com, stpaulcenter.com. And I would also say, as you're an alum of Franciscan, check out Franciscan University of Steubenville, faithandreason.com, and all the resources there. After 30 years, I am more grateful than ever for having spent so much of my life here teaching as a professor.
Mm-hmm. When we first met, just to go back to the full circle, you had just started, and you told the story of just the providential intercession of the Carmelites for your house, your first house there on Bellevue. It's just so great that you're still cranking out high quality material, Dr. Scott Hahn. I'm grateful. Thank you for being a gift, my friend.
Oh, Patrick, thank you so much for your virtual hospitality, but actual friendship for nearly 30 years.
Awesome. The book is called The First Society. I'll show the camera the title. The Sacrament of Matrimony and the Restoration of the Social Order. You can also find it and all the resources that we've mentioned in this episode at patrickcoffin.media. Before we go, I do want to mention that this episode is brought to you by our pilgrimage to Germany. We're going to the Oberammergau Passion Play, May 17th through 25th. Our spiritual director is the one and only Father Willie Raymond, Holy Cross Father, born and raised in a family of 12 from Maine. He's running the cause of canonization for the late great Father Patrick Peyton, famous for the family that prays together, stays together. We're going to Regensburg. We're going to talk about a guy by the name of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. Learn about Catholic Bavaria, Munich. We're going to Dachau. We're going to go across the border to Salzburg and see where The Sound of Music was filmed. So here's how you take advantage of the early bird discount. So don't pay the procrastination tax. Go to patrickcoffin.media/pilgrimage. Find out more at the link below. All right, Scott, we'll be in touch. Godspeed to you.
God bless you, Patrick. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there? Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.